in a culture that I'm not proud of, that we're being civil and not disobedient was the highest value. So
Right.
I'm more, I think you can be engaged in civil disobedience in a quiet, stealth kind of way, and that's what I've chosen to do.
Yeah.
I don't know if you agree or that that's, but.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, I don't know how quiet or stealth it is, but I mean, it's a broad, you know, it's a broad tactic, and there's lots of different ways to do it. You know, I think the youth strikes, you know, are also a form of civil disobedience, right? I mean, like technically, it's not, you're not allowed to skip school. You're supposed to stay in school. So, you know, that's another way is, or striking, you know, general strike, that kind of thing we're calling for, is a, you know, just saying, look, I'm not playing by these rules. I'm not participating. I'm not cooperating anymore. I'm not complying anymore in some way. And I think that can be, yeah, I think that can be also probably through just mentally too, you know, spiritually, not necessarily physically.
I'd like
I was in some actions also during the Civil War, I mean, the anti-war effort. 3 times really, and at no time did I go to jail. But I think that for me, at least, with the people that I was hanging out with and working with, there was less training than is common now about what to do. And looking back on it, I mean, I think it was fine to do, but from my point of view, for me, it was not really all that well thought out. I mean, I just did it, including hiding people who were hiding from the government without thinking about how serious that could be.
There's somebody named Hilder. You want to say something?
Yes, I'm with Rewild Long Island. We're here on Long Island, New York. And we've been reshaping the landscape really quietly by sort of creating the movement by walking over to the other side and taking their hand and walking them back to, you know, stop the use of pesticides and fertilizers and bringing back native plants. But we're doing it in a really fun way where we have like family-friendly events where everybody comes to see butterflies, and then slowly, instead of, because here there is this, they insist on a beautiful lawn that's really spoiling the water supply. So just in that way, in this landscape, it's been very important to, it's kind of like the Trojan horse approach. Like I teach environmental education at the preserve where the hagedorns, you know, run it. That's like Scott's Miracle Grow kind of environment, but we go in and we infiltrate, and then we do it in a really fun and friendly way. And we have now hundreds of families getting rid of the lawn. They've put down cardboard and mulch, and they're planting natives because it's fun and it's something to do with your family that attracts butterflies. So it's kind of like peaceful and fun kind of rebellion in that way, but that's not possible in extreme cases. So I respect everyone's decision.
Hilder, do you have a website, or you have a place where that's written down? Because
yes,
we like to promote various kinds of solutions, and that sounds like it's a really really good piece of the work.
Yeah, we're here at Rewild Long Island .org. We're a completely bottom-up, self-funded, volunteer-based organization. We just recently became a nonprofit. It was driven by, here in my neighborhood, people are still bagging leaves and sending to landfills in plastic bags. So, you know, just a few of us got together a couple of years ago, extremely frustrated by the everyday practices. and we decided to create this movement, and it's actually taken root. So now we're a thing. And it's and we're having, you know, we're finding that education is easier when we're not meeting people in fight flight mode, you know, in that type of like reaching out and not coming in with like, don't do that, but rather, hey, you know, look over here, come to my garden. So we do like we drive around the neighborhood and show alternatives to families. And
Great, thank you.
yes, thank you for having me. Thank you. I've really enjoyed this the Blessed Unrest conference. So thanks for having me.
It was great to have you.
Thank you, Hilda. Yes. John?
John, I have a question or comment.
Yeah.
So I was when I was much younger, I was involved with the SDS and involved in the protests in Washington, D.C.
SDS is Students for a Democratic Society.
Students for Democratic Society. We had a lot of good training. The difference then, it seemed to me, was that we had a very clear, specific objective for our protests. Almost all the protests we did were strictly anti-war. There were some anti-bombing ones and some specifics, but they were all ways to go to get public attention to the movement, and there were never really any specific. I mean, it was a nonviolent confrontation, but it was organized to be nonviolent, and there were never any really specific actions that we could do. And in your case, I wonder, well, what are the specific objectives that that Extinction Rebellion, for instance, had in that English protest that you spoke about, the one in London, and were their objectives, their achievements, how did their achievements line up with their objectives?
Yeah, no, so we do have sort of a set of core demands that we're asking for the government. And they sort of go in a progression in a way. And so step one is to tell the truth and acknowledge the issue. I mean, especially in this country, people aren't really that aware of it. We're not really acknowledging that it's a problem, or certainly our officials are outright denying that anything's actually an issue at all. So that's step one, is tell the truth. And we ask for an official declaration of emergency. That's actually happening in the United States. That's happening. A lot of that's happening locally. Like we're going town by town and city by city and getting those emergency declarations passed. New York City passed one. Miami passed one. A couple major cities in California. I think Sacramento. Don't know about San Francisco. So that's step one, the demand, tell the truth, acknowledge the problem. And then two is to take dramatic steps to both halt biodiversity loss and to reduce carbon emissions, to do that as quickly as possible. And then the third one is about kind of more complicated to explain, but it's asking for a more democratic process around that. So if we, like in the Green New Deal, if we agree that we need to change, we need a mass mobilization, we need to change our ways of life significantly to achieve these goals. What's the best way to do that? Well, we don't trust the current democratic process to do that, to decide what that should be. We want direct citizen participation in making those decisions. And there's actually a framework for doing that called sortition, which has been used successfully in other countries for really difficult political issues, where it's almost like a jury system. They get people to come in and participate. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the US added a fourth demand about prioritizing the people that are most in need of, or the people that would be most affected by a dramatic transition, people whose livelihoods would be lost, or people who are already been who have already been hugely disadvantaged by the current structure, to prioritize those people. So those are the specific things. And in the UK, the emergency declaration was met. So that demand was met. And then it's interesting now, like when I tune into the news over there and watch the sort of, even just watching the sort of mainstream buzz on their big news channels and political conversations, the conversations definitely shifted, and they were talking about, like, what do we do? What are the steps that we need to do? They all acknowledge it's a problem. They acknowledge they need to do something. Now they're debating on, like, what to actually do, and they're not doing it fast enough either. But it's just you can see, like, a very different shift over there than here yet.
But one of the things that I was thinking was that, when we were out protesting the war, I mean, we really didn't think that our government was going to stop the war. We were trying to mobilize public opinion, and we always knew that.
Yes.
And as it turns out, that public opinion just got the government so paranoid that they started to make some mistakes. And, that's stuff. So
I think of it similarly. I mean, I don't.
Right.
I don't really think that our government's going to come out and say, "Oh, okay, yes, here, we'll just give you everything you want." But yeah.
I'd like to
You're kind of frozen, Iona.
pad and pen with me because I climate change. Oh, I'm having they're losing me.
Okay, you sound better now. Try again.
Okay. I've been walking around my apartment trying to find a good place. So anyhow, I publish a climate change newspaper, and my focus has been primarily on young people in Africa who are doing a lot of regenerative farming and permaculture. And in addition to their planting trees and doing things like that, they also, many of them are taking care of orphans in their communities. So I see them as sort of like putting everything together of what we're trying to do. And I even call my newspaper a celebration of youth. And I love what you three have done, and I love hearing about what you've been doing. But my long-term dream is to use my newspaper with a combination of Americans and Africans getting to know each other better, and thereby helping to diminish some of the horrible racism problems, as well as fighting climate change. So I just wanted to sort of introduce myself and say that I will be in touch with you. And my newspaper is called Groundswell News Journal, in case you're interested. And I just love publishing stories. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
I've done a lot of talking. I don't know, Nick and Claire, if you want to any discussions or weigh in on any of these topics.
Yeah. What do you think, Claire? Yeah.
You can go ahead with whatever.
Well, I know Libby had a question too. She put it in the chat. It was, I guess, more specifically aimed at kind of what you were talking about, John. But I wonder if you have a thought on that one too, Claire, about like why less participation in the U.S.
I honestly don't know how I feel about that, especially because I'm also part of other organizations. One being Polluters Out, which is more a huge international presence. And we've actually had problems with too much US centrism and people, there not being enough accommodations for members outside of the US. And so we've been kind of working towards that with multilingual things and making sure that we set meeting times in GMT and not US centrism things. So I think some organizations actually do have internal problems with US centrism, and that's something that we're actively trying to combat.
Yeah, I think what I was getting at wasn't so much the like us sort of addressing problems in the US. It's more like, how do we mobilize more people in our society to get involved? Because when I see the numbers, I don't know. There's definitely, there's obviously definitely different cultures, right, and different things happening. I was actually in London for work. I think it was last summer on the hottest day they've ever recorded in the city. I happened to be there, the hottest day London has ever experienced. It was also right when Boris Johnson was sworn in. I think it was like an interim thing. And there was, like that day, there was just like this email went out like, hey, we're going to protest Boris Johnson. And I went down and there was just like thousands and thousands of people there. And we just took the street and just took it over. I was thinking like, wow, when we try to get things happening in Boston and we get, a couple hundred people and it's super hard to do, it's just very, very hard. So I don't know if that's a cultural thing. Like they're just, people there are just like, yeah, I'm up for a good protest anytime. Count me in, they're like, let's go. Here, maybe maybe people here are more skeptical of the tactic, and think that, oh, this doesn't really get you anywhere or something like that. I don't really know what's going on.
Yeah, there are a few things that like I've read and learned about. Sunrise, I don't think particularly talks about them especially, but the US, I know people write about the fact that it's like a very unique culture because we're very like one of the core like sociological things that kind of comes with like the neoliberal type of idea. If people know, like the neoliberal thing is kind of like the past 40 years dominant political ideology that kind of centers around like deregulation and austerity and sort of like conservatism like that. But some sociologists write about like the Puritan work ethic as being a like very strong feature of Western culture and like pretty predominant in the US, especially, where people are like pretty obedient and say like work is very virtuous and very moral. So we work a lot. So that ties into one thing that I hear from a lot of people is like, oh my gosh, I'm just like swamped with work. I can't even like make the time or energy to come out, or like I'm afraid of losing my job, because we also live in a very precarious culture, right? Like where, because of income inequality, a lot of people, like if they were to have something happen to their livelihood, would just be, totally wrecked. I think people sometimes call that like the precariat class, which is like very large in the US.
I mean, there is a huge segment of the population, right, that just really can't risk getting arrested, right? Because they're gonna, the consequences for them are just gonna be like so much more harsh and life-changing or trajectory-changing than somebody like me. It's just, that is just a reality.
Definitely. I feel like
I have something to add.
Oh, you can go then.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to jump in here. In Colorado, I participated in getting petition signatures on a proposal to change the state constitution I'm not sure it even matters what the change was, although it might, because it would have offended oil and gas interests if we had gotten it passed. But the most common question from people who obviously were in favor of the measure, their question was, will my signature be public? Because my employer will not be happy if they know that I signed it.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
And the other question I have is just about a social safety net and the whole question of leisure. I don't think, you'd think that we'd have the most leisure, being supposedly the most rich country in the world, but I don't think that people have that much leisure. I'm retired, so that's different. But when I look at all the people working more than one job and then having that fear about losing the job, I think that might be a difference between, say, the UK or other countries in Europe. No safety net, no social safety net.
Sorry. Yeah. Just for perspective, something I like to say, tell about is an anthropologist named Marshall Sahlins, who in 1970 or so, 73, wrote a book called Stone Age Economics. And he looked at modern hunter-gatherer cultures and discovered that people had to work about 15 hours a week. That's what we would call work. They may not have called it work. They may have called it just going hunting or going gardening or cooking food or whatever. And he called them the original leisure societies.
Claire was going to say something.
There's also a problem here in that some states.
Oh, yeah. So sorry, I lost my train of thought. But basically what I was going to say is also with like the youth movement, it kind of pertains like not being able to access a strike can be difficult, especially because some of us don't have transportation. And a lot of people I know have been stopped by their parents and don't have support from their parents. And so that means having to like lie to get a strike or something that is like kind of scary. But then some people, I know I have a lot of friends up in XR NYC who've like gotten arrested before they turned 18. And that was just kind of crazy that they were allowed to do that. So it's just very different.
What do you mean they were allowed? Were they allowed or did they just
Their
do
parents
it?
were like, yeah, you can do that, that's fine. Like my parents would have been like, oh no, like
Yeah.
you're not.
My parents would never have said yes to that.
Mhm.
There's also a problem here in that some states are criminalizing even peaceful protests. You don't even have to get arrested to get arrested. They're just making it so criminal over here to voice your opinion and be in the streets.
Mhm.
And it's just also very different for Black and brown activists, especially like looking at what happened at Standing Rock compared to like the quarantine protesters who are like screaming at police. And like if Black and brown people showed up, then
With a bunch of guns, yeah. Like carrying a bunch of guns. Like, yeah, I'm sure that would go over well.
yeah, I'm sure they would love if I showed up and just like screamed at them.
I'm finding this very interesting and a little embarrassing that I haven't, for myself, tried to analyze in a way what are the major challenges that are getting in our way, or some of the challenges. So I started just now making this list. Some of the things I think have already been said, which are very important, is that there's a lot less leisure than when I was in college and in protest movements, both on the part of young people who are more concerned about their ability to get a job or whatever, and older people. We have a strong force out there that's saying there is no problem, that this is just like natural and, you know, get over it and shovel your snow. I think in a way that I never noticed before and maybe wasn't true before, but is certainly true now, is that there are people who are very much aware of what's going on, are very worried about whatever, but they are too discouraged actually in some way to figure out what to do. Or they think that the little thing they do, they shouldn't do the little thing they think of doing because it needs a major effort, and they don't know what major effort to do. So I think Bio for Climate is one of the places where people can get a little less discouraged and take some action. I think that in my lifetime, there's more competition for a sense of urgency. I get to lunch, well, before we all got shut in, but lunch once a month with two other very active people, one of whom is doing nothing but prisons, and the other of whom is doing nothing but immigration. And you can look around and you can find, you know, you want something to work on, there are 19 different essential things that you should be working on, and people cannot do all of them, which, you know, when we were doing anti-war movement, it was mostly the anti-war movement, right? Or women during women's liberation, you weren't also trying to solve 19 other things. So I think that's one thing that's going on that's different. I think there's a higher level of distrust of any kind of government. I think the thing about being obedient, I think, is probably an important thing we should think about, and I haven't been thinking about. There's also, I think, that climate change is complicated, and it helps if you're not terribly afraid of numbers and you're not terribly afraid of science. And that also, I think, is a little different.
Yeah.
And I think also there is a loss of what used to be more local cohesive groups. I mean, I grew up in a neighborhood in which during the harvest, everybody helped everybody else because you had to, or else you couldn't get your oats gathered up. And those kind of local connections have weakened over time. And I don't know, but I'm personally going to try to keep thinking about this list, about the challenges right now that are getting in our way.
You brought up a lot of interesting ones. I think the thing that gives me hope, or the reason I'm in it and doing what I'm doing, is because there are examples from history where it has worked. And there have been times when people really did just get to a point where, like, okay, enough is enough, and they could really understand the choices that we were making and understand that what we were currently doing was wrong and we needed to change. But also I'll admit, like, no one's solved this problem yet, so we don't know if it's possible.
I was going to raise that as a similar.
A very important book, and I can't remember. It's something Hope in the Dark or something. I forgot. I can't remember. Is it Solnit? It's some wonderful writer who talks about the dark of the grave as in contrast with the dark of the womb, and makes the point that you can be doing political action of some kind and it looks like nothing is happening. In fact, it is. So don't give up just because you can't instantly see that you were successful.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful short book.
And
Claire raised the question of burnout, and there's been a lot going on in the chat on burnout, and maybe that's something we should talk about out loud.
I know, like, personally, like, hearing stories from, like, organizers who, like, just lost it. Like, they left the movement. It was just, like, too much. And it's also just, like, so hard if you're part of the mental health community as well, and, like, juggling, like, having, like, I personally have anxiety, and, like, juggling that and, like, constantly working is just so much, and it takes a lot.
So just to do a quick survey, is there anybody here who has not gone through burnout? Everybody all at once now. Let's see.
Ever in their life?
Oh, just say the last 5 years. So
I don't tend to get burned out, really. I don't know. It's just.
But we're still here. We keep coming back.
Yeah.
Well, that's a really good point. Anyway, Claire.
I think the thing about coming back, you know, feeling safe enough to say, I need time off, and having that be recognized as a value, and then being able to take that time and then, you know, come back or start something new after, but that needs to be included in the culture.
Libby, what you just said in chat, you want to say that out loud?
How can the older generation best help these youth movements?
If I could maybe jump in on that one, I think it's actually pretty related to what we were talking about burnout too, and specifically what Claire was saying. I think it's, I mean, speaking, I guess, from like the youth movement side, it's particularly difficult to be, so I guess first, like, teasing apart the distinction between activism and organizing. So like activism is very much like, you go out and you do the rallies and you like show up to marches and, you know, show up to protest. But the organizing is like all the behind the scenes, right? Like, how does it get put together? How do we do all the invitations? How do we get the stage? How do we get the speakers? Who do we invite? which does take a ton of time. So I feel like, teasing that apart, I always think that is like helpful to sort of get at part of the answer. And the other part I think is like, sort of getting back to the leisure thing. So I'm a student too, and I don't know if this resonates with Claire as well, but like being a young person and being a student is like very demanding as is. And then like, it's even different than like working and organizing, which is very much like having two jobs. Like being a student in organizing is just like, it's pretty wild, because being a student can be like, okay, your job is to go to school and go to class. And then your second job is to do homework and do the projects and do all the things that make you look exceptional. And then you organize on top of that. So it can be quite a bit for young people, I think, and really can significantly contributes to the burnout problem. So I think like, in thinking about what like older activists and older organizers can do, I think there are like a lot of support roles and just like doing like the organizing part of like reaching out into the communities and sort of building the infrastructure so that when the time comes to sort of bring folks together for actions and for activisty things, it's like easier to lift up young people and sort of contribute to the time. Yeah, and I think Claire had a good point too.
Yeah, I know a lot of groups, we have adult mentors and we love them and we learn a lot from them.
Bio for Climate, a couple of years ago, came up with the idea of having a mentorship program for high school and college age students where they could work on various kinds of climate activities and organizing and activism for credit. So they could get these credits without going to school. Jed is a lifelong educator, and he's been taking the lead on that program. And what we've discovered is that it's really difficult to get an accrediting institution to back it up. And we're starting to make some progress with that. But the other thing that, I mean, I try to put myself in the position of being a young person now, and it's I spent 15 years in college, which I do not recommend, but it was kind of what I felt I was supposed to do at the time. And if this were the time of what I felt I was supposed to do, I imagine that I would just drop out of school, because yeah, well, you like that idea, huh? Well, the thing is, if this is the urgency that we think it is, what is going to school going to get you? What is a degree going to be worth in a world that's falling apart? And COVID is kind of an intro to that kind of situation. And the education, so Jed and I went to Goddard College, so that's where we met 50 years ago. And we learned things as we wanted to learn them. And we had work session parts of the year where we went out into the community and all that kind of stuff. And the really important things that we need to learn right now, we're not getting that in school. And you can always, especially these days, if you want to learn some physics or math, you just go online and do it. And there are all kinds of opportunities for doing that. Or Jim Laurie, his homeschool students, they're in high school and they go take college courses, optionally. But it's something that really I'm concerned about, because all this incredibly valuable time that that Nick and Claire are spending on school is needed in other ways. And I'm not judging going to school or not on a personal level, but I just, in the context, the culture is so far behind where we need to be. And we would love to encourage people, you know, Claire's age or Nick's age, or even John's age, to be able to do this kind of stuff. Well, it's much easier if you're living at home with parents who are supporting you, unless, of course, they oppose your every move. But there is the need for financial support, obviously. But yeah, that's something that I don't quite get among all of these climate activists that I've met in Zero Hour and Sunrise. They're still going to school. So maybe you have some insights into that for me.
I know, like personally, like I read the IPCC report, like the summary for policymakers for a project for activism, and like I remember more about the IPCC report than I do about like biology. Like that sticks in my head, but like biology doesn't. And I'm also like a research director for another organization, and they were like, "Here, let's learn about research and like a bibliography," and I was like, "I've already learned this. Like I've known this for so long."
Yep. So I would just, for you in particular, Claire, but maybe Nick too, sign up for Jim's class if you can, because somebody's typing very loud. Can you put yourself on mute? Sign up for Jim's class, because he's a very different kind of teacher, and he'll teach you a very different kind of biology. But overall, I mean, this is a problem we're trying to solve. We've made not too much progress, although Jed is working on it and has come up with a couple of good things recently. But I really want to get the kids not on the street so much, in addition to on the street, into actually solving these problems. And whatever it takes, you're building community gardens, or helping trap the methane coming out of the leaky pipes, or whatever it is. There's a zillion things to do. And I wish we could free you up to do those. And it would also, Claire, I mean, you talk about, I don't know the nature of your particular anxiety, but I do know that getting to work is one of the great antidotes to anxiety, right? When you dive into something and you're really engaged in it, especially if you feel like you're making progress, if climate is the cause of anxiety, you feel like you're making some progress on it. It's the best medicine.
I'm going to add also, you know, getting out in nature or working a garden is incredibly healing. I probably don't need to mention the studies that show that, but it brings me to a question that I had for John. At your earlier XR meetings that both Adam and I were at, you were talking about guerrilla gardening. And I wondered whether that ever came to be a focus of XR's thoughts about how to not only dramatize the urgency of what needed to happen, but actually be out there doing it.
Yeah, we talk about it. I don't know that anyone's actually done it. In our chapter, there was a great action they did out in Oregon where some people planted a garden over a like in the way of mechanism. I can't remember, some kind of vehicle, train or truck that was bringing coal to a coal plant. So they planted a garden in the way, which was, you know, partly, I guess it's not quite guerrilla gardening. It's more like using it as a direct action. My experience with that goes actually way back to a friend of mine in college, and we went to school. I went to Ann Arbor in Michigan, and a friend of mine went to live in Detroit, and he was doing that in Detroit, like in the early 80s, like just going and taking over vacant lots and planting gardens. It's something that we totally want to do. I think part of it is we recognize like, oh, it's not enough to just like go out and plant it. We have to keep coming back and nurture it and take care of it. So, we have to have that level of commitment to actually do it. We definitely want to do things that are also like, and especially now, like we've talked about, like what are the kinds of things that we can do now in direct action. It doesn't all have to be civil disobedience. It doesn't all have to be like blocking a road. There are other ways of just getting out with your body and doing something directly. And so that would be one of them. Things like, like restoring an area, like cleaning up a park, or there's a little like wetland area near where I live. It's just like covered with garbage and stuff. Like just organizing a way to get out there and clean it all up, things like that.
Okay, I'd like to hear from Jennifer, who just started talking about a possible umbrella organization, and then Jed, if you could describe Yay a little bit. Jennifer, why don't you start?
Well, I sort of wrote my idea. I don't have more than that.
Okay.
Listening to you, Adam, and I think the livelihood issue is a real stumbling point. And I think sounds like we're in agreement that these organizers are doing really important work, and they should get paid for it. They should be able to support themselves, however modestly, but be able to be independent and not rely on their parents. This is important. And if they want to put off school or have this be their job or their career instead of another, then there should be a structure and infrastructure to make that possible.
It recalls the Civilian Conservation Corps to a certain extent, but we also need to be able to fund Claire or Nick if they decide that this is their full-time job.
Right, and we can't rely on the government.
And you too, John.
The CCC came from.
Right, we cannot rely on the government at this point. So there are all kinds of mechanisms out there, and it would require a lot of work to pull them together to make it happen, in terms of anything from crowdfunding to foundation grants to bake sales. I don't know, but I mean there are ways to do it, and people have done it, and a lot of it has to do with living very cheaply, but it's not simple. There's no simple answers there.
I know personally, like there have been a couple events that I tried to attend, and it just was where like cost might have been a barrier, like going to DC or getting a train ticket, and organizers have offered to pay for my ticket or pay for my train ticket or plane. And so that's been like, even though I might not have ended up working out, like just like the offer was really important.
Right. So Jed, do you want to talk about Yay? Yay is the program I was talking about. It's YEA, stands for Youth Education and Activism. Can't hear you. Okay, this is an ongoing challenge, computer challenge.
Try Alt A.
No, Paul, that's not it. Yeah, why don't you call in?
Can I jump in here for a sec?
Sure.
There were two things I wanted to say. First, I think that my generation, we really have we have a lot of blame to take for the situation we've gotten into. Basically, after the 60s and moving into the 70s, I and most of my friends, we dropped out of being activists, and like so many people, we kind of thought that our objectives were to, get a career and to make money and to move along in in society and so forth. And I kind of feel like we really let our whole culture down. And now the problem has gotten beyond us. I mean, all of these problems that we're encountering now, we knew about in the 60s. We were warned about them. And we were warned about the military-industrial complex a long time ago, but somehow we let it get away from us. And so today, when we're looking at all these little individual problems, somebody was talking about, well, there's this problem and there's that problem and there's this problem, and we're overwhelmed. It's really the one big problem. It's our economic system and how we've all allowed the corporations and the government to exploit the land and to exploit the people to the point when it's almost unfightable. And, at a certain level, and I kind of hate to say this, and it's not the only thing I'm going to say, but we need a real revolution. But we all know that a revolution, if any progressive revolution came along, we would turn our country into a fascist state in a nanosecond. So that's kind of by way of apology. But the other thing I wanted to say about the burnout thing is that the only way to avoid burnout in a way is to have some victories and to get some positive feedback. And one of the problems with the big picture climate change movement is that because the focus has been for such a long time on fossil fuels and on cutting carbon emissions, that everybody is hitting their head against the wall. And there's just no positive feedback, and there never will be. And I think that one of the big things that I got out of Biodiversity for a Livable Climate and through other research I've done is that and somebody should really be saying this in a big scale, is that carbon emissions are not the problem, and cutting carbon emissions is not going to solve the problem. And everybody, most of the people in government, they don't know this, but they do know that they cannot possibly stop the carbon emissions, because it would bring our whole society down. We'd tumble down in no time. And no problem.
Like the coronavirus.
Like the coronavirus, right? And but the question is, okay, this coronavirus is a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity for us to rebuild a society. But does anybody think that's going to happen? That we're somehow, everybody wants to be going back to the old normal, go back to the economic system as it is. And, that's not what we really want. But then, what do we want? But I think that if somehow we could start getting it across that it's not about climate, the climate is not about the cutting fossil fuels, and that's not going to help anyway, if reducing the carbon emissions. If that education could get out there and people could start to see that there are plenty of avenues to get little victories, and they're not going to be easily won. Planting a garden is great. And every time you plant something, every time you change your eating habits, that makes a more of a difference than buying a Prius. But how do we get that out to the public? And I think that's how the kind of my generation can maybe help the people more on the streets. Although I'm happy to go on the streets if I needed to, or if I found a street that would have me. Is to really start to get the messaging in a way that ordinary people, because there's a huge awareness of the problem, huge awareness of how severe the problem is amongst, really amongst so much of the middle class. And yet everybody is focused on carbon. So how do we get that huge awareness? How do we get people more aware of the biodiversity issue and really the destructiveness that has brought this about, and how to stop that destructiveness? I don't have the answer, But I do think that that's where the burnout comes from, is hitting our head against the wall. I don't know if that made any sense, but anyway.
Yeah, it made a lot of sense. Before, like yesterday, Adam and I were, and folks were talking before the session and talking about coronavirus, and you know, one of the things that I think is interesting is that it did illustrate that we can rapidly change functioning of society, like almost overnight. I know it has had devastating consequences in many ways, but it's interesting to me. Like I just saw some opinion polling on it, where overwhelming majority of people, despite what you'll see on TV with these protesters with guns in Michigan or whatever, but overwhelming majority of people support doing whatever it takes to slow down the spread of the virus, to stay in lockdown mode, to continue social distancing, to listen to the health experts and science experts. And so that, in some way was encouraging to me.
And do you think that there's a way that we can get the message out that the cause of the coronavirus is the same as the cause of climate change? I mean, the destruction of our environment, destruction of the land. I don't know what that would do, but that would be a piece of information.
Yeah.
One thing on that I think is pretty interesting that Claire brought up when she was talking about 0 hour is, and this is, I guess, just food for thought, but Sunrise, I know, has had like a lot of success in sort of like where the message has been hard to get across from a scientific angle and from like a logical angle. One of our like core beliefs and strategies is that we tell stories, because it's much easier to like resonate emotionally with people when you're talking about ways that it affects you and has like really affected your life. So I wonder that like in any of the messaging we try to get across, whether it's for biodiversity or linking COVID and climate change, or coronavirus and climate change, or really any of our efforts, that we really double down on like meeting people where they're at, not being like super facty and sciencey about it, even though the facts and science are obviously incredibly important, but really trying to emotionally resonate with people too.